Appenzell Innerrhoden in northeastern Switzerland. Long ago, the people here recognized that they could not live from grazing cows alone. So this tough and self-reliant folk set about determining their own future. Appenzell around the year 1800. Appenzell women were already considered to be skillful home workers. Hand spinning, an important source of extra income in a rural environment, was gradually being replaced by embroidery, an occupation that required both needlework skills and concentration at the tambour, or embroidery frame. After 1820, coarse embroidery was superseded by fine embroidery, which was altogether more demanding. For the first time, the special skills of the women of Appenzell could be employed to full effect. They created products of extremely high quality, unique examples of the art of embroidery, which were exported by the merchants of St. Gallen and Appenzell Ausserrhoden to places as far away as America. Around 1850, machine embroidery came to eastern Switzerland. It hit hand embroidery hard. The heavy manual embroidery machine, the iron worker, did the work of up to 40 embroiderers in a single operation. This new development made it possible to satisfy the growing worldwide demand for embroidery products. Manual and shuttle embroidery machines were constantly improved, and the materials became finer. The products of eastern Switzerland's embroidery industry, known as St. Gallen lace, became world famous. By about 1880, industrialization in eastern Switzerland was making further advances. Embroidery factories were shooting up like mushrooms. Fine hand embroidery went into retreat, becoming exclusively confined to the area of Appenzell Innerrhoden. The embroiderers bravely faced up to the tough competition. Frau Marie Manser lives near the town of Appenzell. She can still remember the time when embroidery was practiced in almost every home. As a 5-year-old child, she was already active, contributing to the family income.
Wir waren in der Familie zum 12. Der Vater und die Mutter und 10 Gofen. 5 Buben und 5 Mädchen. Ich war die Älteste. Und auch die erste hat mir so mal helfen weichen. Die Mutter hat mich gelehnt. Sie konnte Lädeli-Tüchli machen. Basi Josefa hat eine Fickerei gehabt. Dann hat sie mir Tüchli gegeben. Also wir konnten lehnen weichen, lehnen Lädeln und ausnähen. Meine Schwester, die hat mir so lehnen Blätter sofort, Rösli und Bläckli. Und die andere hat auch noch wieder eine andere Sorte müssen Blätter. Wir sind zum Vierten auf der Stubenbank gesessen.
By 1920, half the female population of Appenzell Innerrhoden was working at embroidery. In almost every home, young and old were producing lavishly worked underwear, delicately embroidered blouses, and artistic handkerchiefs. The level of employment was high. After the First World War, wages had recovered. But during the war years, the number of embroiderers had dropped from 3,500 to 2,000. Embroidery was practiced mostly as a sideline, a part-time job that was urgently needed by many farming families. The parlor served as both living area and place of work. It was quite normal for even small children to be introduced to the art of embroidery by their mother. Their parents wanted them to learn at an early age how hard it was to earn a living. Straight after school, girls were required to carry out their allotted tasks at the embroidery frame. This work required concentration, perseverance, and skill. The children were required to continue embroidering almost without a break, which meant that household and kitchen chores were often neglected. The diet in many families was deficient and one-sided. The main reason for this was that an embroiderer's hands needed to be looked after extremely well. Cooking, washing, and garden work made the hands rough and therefore unsuitable for the delicate work with needle and thread. So in many families, it was the less gifted daughters who performed the necessary work around the house. Doing commercial work at home enabled families to enjoy a certain independence. An embroiderer was proud of the unconstrained nature of her occupation. She was able to organize her work as it suited her best. In simple front rooms throughout Appenzell Innerrhoden, delicate works of art of extremely high quality were created, embroidered with great skill and extraordinary dedication. The embroidery designer was an important partner of the manufacturer. Working closely together, the two of them attempted to respond to the subtle trends of the fashion market. A flair for the new, as well as artistic sensitivity, were crucial in maximizing sales of the finished embroidery. A stupfel, or pricking device, was used to punch holes in the finished drawing, thus creating a template. The distance between adjacent holes was less than 1 millimeter. The designs confirmed the Appenzeller's fondness for tradition, the motifs being rather limited in their artistic freedom. Only after being prompted by the painter Hans Caspar Ulrich did it become common, after 1914, to depict people in profile and therefore more expressively. Graphite dust was applied to the stupfel. The dust passed through the perforations, thereby transferring the design to the fabric. The design was then fixed, allowing the delicate fabric to be handled by the embroiderer. Embroidery frame, needles, scissors, and thread were the only utensils required for this handicraft. All the more numerous were the various stitch types. These bore onomatopoeic names that were firmly anchored in the Appenzell vernacular. The flat stitch, platte, was the stitch type most commonly used. It was employed mainly to depict flowers, leaves, and blossom. The three-dimensional effect that could be achieved using only very thin thread shows up especially well here. In drawn thread work, the design was produced by drawing individual threads, in this example every third thread in the warp and weft directions, out of the body of the backing fabric. In the case of the hollow stitch hulle, the threads were bunched together. The resulting grid enabled the embroiderer to work in new motifs. In cut work, known as spätzle, whole pieces were cut out of the fabric. The spaces thus created were adorned with fine thread using filling stitches. A wide variety of so-called spätzmöckli were created in this way. The embroiderer used pelzen to depict figures or entire pictures. In 1850, between 70 and 90 different stitches were in use. They were varied and combined with unbelievable accuracy. Many of these stitches are not mastered by any of today's embroiderers. In addition, it's becoming increasingly difficult to obtain thread and needles of the required fineness. The specialization of the embroiderers in individual stitches was in the interests of the employer. The fabrics thus passed through many hands before they were completed. Each embroiderer was a specialist who was paid according to the level of difficulty of her speciality. For example, embroiderers in 1920 were paid an hourly wage of 30 centimes for simple Leiterlen, whereas complicated Figuren designs commanded up to 1 franc 50 centimes.
Meine Mutter hat Tag und Nacht gewerkt, fast noch belichtet, manchmal bis um 10, 11, weil man es eben gebraucht hat. Und wir haben manchmal auch belichtet. Und die Kleinen, die Therese und Josie, die haben vielleicht zu den kleineren Buben müssen schauen. So die wenn man nimmt, hat man zu den Shoppen gehen oder Milch und Bröckli gehen. Dann hat es auch sonst nicht, die Mutter konnte werken. Die Mutter hat fast nichts den Willen gehabt, sonst nichts zu tun. Es hat einfach gewerkt sein.
In the case of single women and widows, embroidery was the main way of earning a living. For farming families, it was an important and very necessary additional source of income. Many farms had only 2 to 3 hectares of land and were simply too small to feed a family. The often harsh weather of the pre-alpine region only permitted grass farming and animal breeding. Working in the fields, cowsheds, and pigsties was man's work. Women were only required to lend a hand during the hay harvest. But hay fork and fine embroidery needle do not go well together. An embroiderer's hands must stay clean and supple for her delicate work. Like the girls at their embroidery frames, the boys too had work to do. From an early age, they were allotted tasks around the farm. Embroiderers often worked long into the night. A narrow beam of light could be focused onto the embroidery by positioning the lamp behind a glass bowl filled with water. The eyes of the embroiderer were already tired and irritated from a long day's work, but her stint was not yet done, her earnings not yet sufficient. In the 1920s, child labor was customary in Appenzell Innerrhoden. Anemia, lung diseases, and growth disorders were widespread due to lack of exercise and nutritional deficiencies. In addition to obligatory school attendance, 86% of all girls sat at their embroidery work for between 3 and 7 hours every day. During school holidays, they spent up to 12 hours in a poor posture, carrying out their tiring work. Coffee was drunk as a stimulant to overcome tiredness and to restore the required concentration. Many a family was terrified that bad times with little work were just around the corner. So as long as work was available, the embroiderers kept up their daunting work schedule. The women working from their homes were dependent upon the verker, who took the work round from embroiderer to embroiderer. He supplied them with raw materials and paid cash for the finished work. The smallest mistake would result in a deduction. The embroiderers never managed to organize themselves or to bargain collectively for better wages. Quite the opposite. The competition among the embroiderers themselves and poorly paid child labor always kept earnings for this demanding work at a relatively low level.
Wir haben zum Beispiel gar nie gewusst, woher das kommt. Das hat man nicht gewusst. Das hat vielleicht der Fabrikant gewusst. Die hat Beziehungen im Ausland, weiss ich, bis woher, bis aus Amerika oder noch weiter. Ich weiss es nicht. Aber wir haben es nicht gewusst. Aber man hat gleich Freude gehabt, wenn man was hatte, wenn man Leben hatte. Wenn man auch nicht viel verdient hat. Nichts war nicht viel gesehen. Da auch.
Sometimes it was necessary to take the finished work to the verker. For an embroiderer working from a remote farmstead, this was an opportunity to get some exercise and fresh air, and was a welcome change in the daily routine. The close attachment to the Catholic Church had positive consequences for the hard-working and deeply religious embroiderers. They did not work on Sundays or on any of the numerous religious holidays. Instead, they were able to rest and recuperate. New York, Vienna, London, Berlin, Paris. The elegant hand-embroidered articles from Appenzell were exported worldwide. Only about a quarter of these luxury articles remained in Switzerland. The finest embroidered handkerchiefs commanded prices between 50 and 500 Swiss francs. So they were sent out in envelopes to avoid the high import duties. Was the demand for them due to an appreciation of beautiful things, to vanity, or to a fondness for ostentation on the part of the nobility? Whatever the case, their popularity was a blessing for Appenzell's hand embroidery industry. The ornate embroidered articles made in the simple front rooms of countless Appenzell farmsteads were worn by the upper class and decorated the tables of crowned heads. Lucerne, Interlaken, and St. Moritz. Famous health resorts with magnificent luxury hotels. Here, under the eyes of the well-to-do, the women of Appenzell would demonstrate their ability. Dressed in their Tracht, the traditional costume of Innerrhoden, they sat at their embroidery frames in the most exclusive shops of Zurich, Berlin, and Amsterdam, and showed off their extraordinary needlework skills. Government-subsidized hand embroidery courses had been offered in Appenzell since 1889, with the aim of encouraging the rising generation of embroiderers. Only work of the very highest quality made it possible for Appenzell hand embroidery to prevail against cheaper and inferior products from neighboring countries and China.
In den 30er Jahren hat es ja dann geheißen, Frauen und Zauen halt ins Land. Da sind eben die Zauen, wenn wir schwenken beim Züchten, hat es Geld gegeben, ist es gut gegangen. Und die Frauen wacker gewächert haben, hat es auch Geld gegeben. Darum hat es geheißen, Frauen und Zauen halt ins Land. Wienerode. Das war ja auch wahr. Man hatte ja sonst nichts gehabt. Man hatte keine anderen Möglichkeiten gehabt. Hat niemand etwas anderes gewusst. Wirklich nicht.
Fashionable luxury products are vulnerable to economic crises, overemployment, alternated with shortage of work due to falling sales. The embroiderers were directly affected by these cyclic changes. Declining prices brought hardship to many farming and embroidering families. The better off among them were able to use the shortage of work to do some embroidery for themselves.
Nachher hat man noch für die Tracht auch angefangen, als man die Trachtenkräge gemacht hat. Aber das war ein Luxus, wenn man es für sich selber gemacht hat. Dann hat man so eine Art Vermögen, wenn man einen Kragen machen selber für ihn. Dann war man besser gestellt auf ihn.
A scene from a film with a regional background, made in the 1940s. The cheerful embroiderers could not obscure the fact that elegant Appenzell hand embroidery had long since passed its heyday. Embroidery was going out of fashion, and exports were falling from year to year. Only a few embroiderers remained loyal to their craft. Frau Manser is one of them. Although over 80, she still embroiders for up to 3 hours daily. But she finds it difficult to understand the reasons behind the sad decline of this noble art.
Ja, das ist einfach. Ich nehme an, wegen dem Krieg und wegen dem Ausland oder Konkurrenz aus dem Ausland und die Maschinenstickerei. Sie bist halt auch eine Konkurrenz, auch heute noch. Und sie geht halt ringer und sie bist halt alles billiger. Die müssen nicht so viel Stand, wenn man so an Zeug weichen. Wenn den Hebel runter und dann sind sie geht eben ringer, wieder so Tag und Nacht. Die Augen rausschauen, wie man dem früher gesagt hat.
Today, embroidery is little more than a pastime for a handful of committed women, some of whom are quite young. But we should be thankful that at least part of the great art of embroidery has been preserved. Today's enthusiasts keep memories alive of a time in which more than half of all women and girls in Inner Roden would work away at their embroidery frames, a time when the name Appenzell was synonymous throughout the world with hand embroidery of unique and exquisite quality.